should have never answered that telegram from Pine Ridge. This is a horror story about what happens when the past refuses to stay buried, and how some secrets are worth dying for. Pine Ridge Dairy Farm, Vermont, 1938. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I was a dairy inspector for the state of Vermont in 1938. What I witnessed at the Pine Ridge Dairy Farm that autumn changed everything I believed about life, death, and the thin veil between worlds. The telegram was simple: urgent inspection needed. Strange milk production issues. Come immediately. I packed my leather satchel, loaded my Ford, and drove through the October mist toward what would become my nightmare. The farm sat isolated in a valley surrounded by pine trees that seemed to whisper warnings I should have heeded. If you like real horror stories, leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. The gravel road crunched beneath my tires as I approached Pine Ridge Dairy Farm on that grey October morning. The mist hung low over the rolling hills of Vermont, creating ghostly fingers that seemed to reach through the bare branches of ancient maples. October 15th, 1938. The farmhouse stood 3 stories tall, its white paint peeling like diseased skin, black shutters hanging crooked as broken teeth. Behind it, the red barn dominated the landscape, its weathered boards dark with age and moisture. I parked near the front porch where pumpkins sat rotting, their carved faces collapsed into grotesque grins. The silence struck me first. No mooing cattle, no clucking chickens, no barking dogs. Only the whisper of wind through dying leaves and the distant creak of something swaying in a breeze. My breath formed small clouds as I climbed the sagging wooden steps. Before I could knock, the door swung open. Ezra Blackwood stood before me, a tall, gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes the color of winter storms. His clothes hung loose on his skeletal frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he extended one toward me. "Inspector Whitmore," his voice rasped like sandpaper on wood. "Thank God you've come. We have problems." I followed him into the dim interior where the smell of sour milk and something else, something sweet and rotten, filled my nostrils. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet as we walked through rooms filled with covered furniture and family portraits whose eyes seemed to track our movement. "Tell me about these production issues," I said, pulling out my notebook. But Ezra's attention had drifted to the staircase leading to the second floor. He stared upward with an expression I couldn't quite read, fear mixed with something else, something that made my skin crawl. "What do you think was really wrong with the milk production at Pine Ridge Farm? Leave your thoughts in the comments below." Ezra led me through the kitchen where cast iron pots sat cold on a massive wood-burning stove. Dishes lay unwashed in the sink, covered with a thin film of something that looked like spoiled cream. The back door hung slightly ajar, letting in streams of pale morning light that illuminated dancing dust motes. "The milk," Ezra began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been different. Started about 2 weeks ago. The color's wrong, the taste." He shuddered, wrapping his thin arms around his chest. We stepped outside into the crisp air where my breath immediately formed thick clouds. The barn loomed before us, its massive doors slightly open, revealing only darkness within. I could hear something moving inside, not the comfortable sounds of cattle, but something else entirely. A rhythmic scraping, like fingernails on wood. "How many head of cattle do you have?" I asked, trying to maintain professional composure despite the growing unease in my chest. 23, he replied, but his eyes darted nervously toward the house. "Though, we've lost a few recently." The smell grew stronger as we approached the barn, that sickly sweet odor of decay mixed with fresh hay and manure. But underneath it all was something else, something that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase, petals brown and slimy with rot. "Where's your family, Mr. Blackwood?" I asked, suddenly realizing I hadn't seen his wife or the daughter mentioned in his file. His face went pale, and he stopped walking entirely. His hands began to shake more violently, and when he spoke, his voice cracked like a teenage boy's. "My wife, she's been ill. Stays upstairs mostly. And Sarah." He paused, swallowing hard. "Sarah doesn't speak anymore." The scraping sound from the barn grew louder, more insistent. It sounded almost like someone trying to claw their way out of something. "Where are you watching this from? Tell me your city and country in the comments. I love connecting with viewers from around the world." The barn's interior hit me like a physical blow. The stench was overwhelming: spoiled milk, rotting hay, and that persistent sweet decay that seemed to coat my throat with every breath. But it was the silence that truly unnerved me. 23 cattle should have made some noise. yet the barn felt as empty as a tomb. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through gaps in the weathered boards. The stalls lined both sides of the central walkway, each one equipped with feeding troughs and milking stations. But as I walked deeper into the barn, I realized something was terribly wrong. The cattle were there, standing motionless in their stalls, but they didn't move when we approached. They didn't turn their heads, didn't swish their tails, didn't even seem to breathe. Their eyes were open, staring straight ahead with a glassy, lifeless quality that made my stomach lurch. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, my voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space, "are these animals alive?" He nodded frantically, but his face had gone ashen. "They still produce milk," he whispered. "Every morning, the buckets are full. But they don't move, don't eat, don't make any sound." I approached the nearest stall cautiously. The cow stood perfectly still, its black and white hide appearing normal except for a strange pallor around its eyes. I reached out to touch its flank, and my hand jerked back immediately. The flesh was cold, unnaturally cold, like touching marble in winter. "How long have they been like this?" I asked, backing away from the stall. "It started with one," Ezra replied, wringing his hands. "Old Bessie, our best producer. Then the next day, 2 more. By the end of the week." He gestured helplessly at the rows of motionless cattle. That's when I heard it, a soft humming coming from somewhere above us in the hayloft. A child's voice, sweet and melodic, singing a lullaby I didn't recognize. The sound made every hair on my arm stand on end, not because it was frightening, but because it was so completely out of place in this house of horrors. I had built my career on facts, on logical explanations for agricultural problems. Diseases had symptoms, contamination had sources, and every mystery had a rational solution. But standing in that barn, surrounded by living corpses that somehow still produced milk, I felt my understanding of the world begin to crack like ice under spring sun. The humming continued, soft and hypnotic, floating down from the loft like autumn leaves. Ezra had gone completely rigid beside me, his breathing shallow and rapid. When I looked at his face, I saw naked terror in his eyes, not surprise, but the fear of someone who had been expecting this moment. "That's Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's been up there since it started." I looked up toward the loft, but the shadows were too deep to see anything clearly. The humming grew slightly louder, and I could make out words now, though they seemed to be in a language I didn't understand. The melody was beautiful, hauntingly so, but it made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "I need to examine the milk these animals are producing." He nodded and led me to a collection of metal buckets near the barn's entrance. The milk inside was white, but it had an oily quality that made it shimmer strangely in the dim light. When I leaned closer, the sweet sick smell nearly made me gag. But it was what I saw floating on the surface that made my hands begin to shake. Tiny white flowers, delicate as baby's breath, floated in perfect circles on the milk surface. When I stirred one bucket with a wooden ladle, the flowers moved in patterns that seemed almost intentional, almost like they were trying to form letters or symbols. The humming stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed felt heavy and expectant. In that moment of perfect quiet, I heard something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The sound of small feet walking across the floorboards above us, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the hayloft. My scientific mind screamed for rational explanations, but my instincts, honed by 40 years of life, told me I was in the presence of something that defied all natural law. The milk, the silent cattle, the humming child, the floating flowers, they were all pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. But I was trapped now by my own curiosity and professional duty. I had come here to inspect a dairy farm, and inspect it I would, no matter what horrors waited in the shadows above. I climbed the wooden ladder to the hayloft with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Each rung groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the barn like gunshots. Ezra remained below, standing perfectly still among his silent cattle, watching me ascend with eyes that held no hope. The loft was dark except for thin streams of light filtering through cracks in the roof. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, and the air was thick with the smell of old hay and something else, lilacs, sweet and cloying, as if someone had scattered the flowers everywhere. I reached the top of the ladder and pulled myself onto the rough wooden floor. Bales of hay created a maze of shadows and hiding places, and in the center of it all, I could see a small figure sitting with her back to me. Sarah Blackwood couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She sat cross-legged on a patchwork quilt, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the dim light. Her dark hair hung straight down her back, and she was holding something in her hands, something that caught and reflected the light like water. "Sarah," I called softly. She didn't turn around, but she began to hum again, that same haunting melody that had followed me up from below. As she hummed, I noticed that flowers were scattered all around her, fresh lilacs and baby's breath, impossible in October, their petals perfect and white as fresh snow. I took a step closer, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. Sarah's humming grew louder, and I realized she was humming in harmony with herself, as if there were multiple voices coming from her small frame. "Sarah, my name is Thomas. I'm here to help." That's when she turned around, and I understood why Ezra had looked at me with such terror. Sarah's eyes were completely white, no pupils, no iris, just blank white orbs that seemed to reflect light from somewhere else entirely. But it was her smile that truly frightened me, too wide, too knowing, the expression of someone far older than her years. She held up what she'd been cradling in her hands, a glass jar filled with that same oily milk I'd seen in the buckets below. But this milk was moving, swirling in patterns that defied gravity, and suspended within it were dozens of tiny white flowers that pulsed like beating hearts. When Sarah opened her mouth to speak, her voice was not that of a child. It was layered, harmonious, like a choir singing in perfect unison. "The milk remembers everything, Inspector Whitmore. Every tear, every prayer, every scream." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that children's eyes don't turn white, that milk doesn't move on its own, that flowers don't bloom in October. But the evidence was right in front of me, smiling with that terrible knowing expression, holding a jar of liquid that seemed to contain all the sorrows of the world. Sarah stood up gracefully, the jar still cradled in her small hands. As she moved toward me, the flowers scattered around the loft began to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light. The air grew colder with each step she took, and my breath came out in thick white clouds. "Do you want to know what happened to the milk, Inspector?" she asked, her voice still that impossible chorus. "Do you want to know why it tastes of tears and dreams and the last breath of dying things?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare into those blank white eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. "It started with me," she said, and for just a moment, her voice cracked and I heard the frightened child underneath all that otherworldly harmony. "It started when I died." The jar in her hands began to glow brighter, and I could see more clearly what was suspended in the milk, not flowers, but tiny hands, reaching upward as if trying to claw their way out of a liquid grave. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I tried to scream, but my voice had abandoned me entirely. All I could do was stand there in that haunted loft, watching a dead child show me the secrets that should have stayed buried with her in the cold Vermont earth. The confession that poured from Sarah's lips in that ghostly hayloft shattered every belief I'd ever held about life and death. Her voice, that impossible chorus, told me a story that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "I drowned," she said, settling back down on her quilt as if we were having a normal conversation. "Last spring, when the creek was swollen with snow melt. I was picking flowers for Mama's birthday when the bank gave way beneath my feet." The jar in her hands pulsed with that strange inner light, and I could see the tiny hands inside moving frantically, as if they were trying to swim to the surface. Papa found me 3 days later, caught in the roots of an old willow tree. My lungs were full of water and silt and the taste of winter. She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. But Papa couldn't let go. He brought me home, laid me in my bed, and pretended I was just sleeping. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Sarah, you're not. You can't be." She laughed, and the sound was like wind chimes made of bone. "Dead. Oh, Inspector, death is such a simple word for something so complicated. Papa buried my body under the lilac bush behind the house, but he kept my room exactly as it was. He talked to me, brought me meals, read me stories." The white flowers scattered around her began to pulse in rhythm with her words, creating a hypnotic light show that made my head spin. And slowly, very slowly, I began to answer back. Not with my voice, my throat was full of creek mud and decay, but with other things. The milk from our cows started to taste different. Sweet at first, like the lilacs Papa planted on my grave, but then it began to taste like tears. I watched in horror as she unscrewed the lid of the jar. The smell that rose from it was indescribable, flowers and death and something that might have been innocence if innocence could rot. Every morning, Papa would find buckets of this special milk. He told himself it was a gift, a miracle. But Mama knew better. She could taste the sorrow in every drop, feel the cold touch of the grave on her tongue. Sarah dipped one finger into the jar, and when she pulled it out, the milk clung to her skin like liquid silk. Would you like to taste it, Inspector? Would you like to know what death feels like when it's mixed with a father's love and a mother's grief? I backed away, but she followed me across the loft, her white dress rustling like autumn leaves. Behind her, the flowers began to wither and turn black, creating a trail of decay in her wake. The cattle felt it first, she continued, her voice growing sadder with each word. They could sense what I'd become, what I was doing to their milk. One by one, they stopped moving, stopped living, but Papa needed them to keep producing. So I helped them. I sang to them, shared my gift with them, made them like me. I realized with growing horror that the humming I'd been hearing wasn't just Sarah's voice. It was a chorus of the dead, all the creatures that had succumbed to whatever curse she carried. And now you're here, Inspector, she said, standing directly in front of me with that jar of nightmare milk in her hands. You came to solve a mystery, but mysteries like this aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be fed. She held out the jar toward me, and I could see my own reflection in its contents, distorted, pale, already looking like a ghost. Drink, Thomas Whitmore, she commanded, her voice becoming that terrible chorus again. Taste what we've made for you. Join the silence that lives beneath the earth and above the sky. The jar was inches from my lips when I finally found the strength to move. I knocked the jar from Sarah's hands and it shattered against the wooden floor, spilling that cursed milk across the hay-covered boards. The moment the glass broke, Sarah let out a scream that was definitely not human. It was the sound of wind through cemetery gates, of earth falling on coffin lids, of every grief that had ever been swallowed and left to fester. The flowers around us burst into flames that gave off no heat, only a cold, blue-white light that made everything look like it was underwater. The smell of lilacs became overwhelming, choking, as if I was drowning in a perfumed grave. You don't understand. Sarah shrieked, her white eyes now streaming tears that looked like melted snow. Papa needs the milk. The farm needs the milk. They'll all starve without the milk. I ran for the ladder, but as I reached it, I heard footsteps pounding up from below. Ezra's voice called out, desperate and raw, Sarah, what's happening? What did he do? I started down the ladder as fast as I could, but Ezra was already halfway up, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been madness. You've upset her, he screamed. You've made her cry. Above us, Sarah's wailing grew louder, and I could hear the barn itself beginning to groan and creak as if the building was in pain. The silent cattle below began to stir for the first time since I'd arrived, but their movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. I reached the bottom of the ladder just as the first cow turned its head toward me. Its eyes were as wide as Sarah's, and when it opened its mouth, that same impossible harmony poured out, the sound of a dead girl singing lullabies to her father's broken dreams. Ezra grabbed my arm with fingers that felt like iron clamps. She's been so lonely, he said, his own eyes beginning to turn that terrible, empty white. She just wants someone to play with, someone to share the milk with. The other cattle were moving now, their hooves making wet, squelching sounds on the barn floor. They surrounded us in a slow, shambling circle, their white eyes reflecting the cold fire from above. She drowned, Mr. Blackwood, I said, trying to reach whatever sanity might be left in him. Your daughter drowned. She needs to rest. His grip tightened, and I felt bones grinding together in my arm. She's not dead, he screamed. She talks to me every day. She makes the milk sweet and helps with the chores and sings me to sleep at night. The cattle were closing in, and I could smell the decay on their breath, could see maggots crawling in and out of their nostrils. Above us, Sarah's voice had changed again, becoming lower, more adult, speaking words in that unknown language that made my ears bleed. I tore free from Ezra's grip and ran for the barn door, but the cattle moved to block my path. They didn't attack, just stood there swaying slightly, their dead eyes tracking my movements while that horrible harmony poured from their mouths. I was trapped in a barn full of the living dead, with a grieving father who couldn't accept his loss and a drowned girl who had found a way to claw her way back from the grave through sheer force of paternal love and desperate denial. The sweet smell of lilacs was everywhere now, so thick I could taste it on my tongue, and I realized with growing horror that I was beginning to understand the words Sarah was singing. She was calling me home. I pressed my back against the barn wall, trying to find some gap in the boards, some way to escape that didn't involve walking through the circle of dead cattle. Above me, Sarah's voice had become hypnotic, seductive, promising peace and rest and an end to all the struggles of the living world. Ezra approached me slowly, his movements just as jerky and unnatural as his livestock. "She likes you, Inspector," he said, his voice now part of that impossible harmony. "She wants you to stay. She wants you to help us make more milk." I could see now how it had started, how grief and love had twisted together into something monstrous. A father who couldn't let his daughter go, a child who couldn't find peace while her father's pain anchored her to the world of the living. Together, they had created something that was neither life nor death, but a horrible mockery of both. "The state will send others when I don't return," I managed to say, though my voice was beginning to sound strange to my own ears. Ezra smiled, and his teeth were stained with that oily milk. "Others have come, Inspector. The veterinarian from Brattleboro, the agricultural agent from Montpelier, even a pastor who thought he could perform an exorcism." My blood turned to ice. "Where are they?" "They're here," he said, gesturing around the barn. "They've always been here. Sarah collected them, just like she collected the cattle. They help us now. They understand what we are trying to do." That's when I saw them, human shapes standing motionless in the darker corners of the barn, wearing clothes from different decades, their faces slack and their eyes that terrible, empty white. Men who had come to investigate the strange reports from Pine Ridge Dairy Farm and had never left. I was looking at my own future, and it was singing lullabies in the voice of a dead child. The realization that I was staring at the fate of every man who had dared to investigate Pine Ridge Farm sent a surge of desperate energy through my body. I couldn't become one of those silent figures standing in the shadows, couldn't let Sarah add my voice to her growing chorus of the dead. As the circle of cattle and corpses closed in around me, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a rusty pitchfork from the wall and swung it wildly at the nearest cow. The metal tines passed through its flesh as if it were made of fog, and the creature didn't even flinch. "You can't hurt them, Inspector," Ezra said sadly. "They're beyond pain now, beyond fear, beyond all the troubles that plague the living." Above us, Sarah's singing reached a crescendo, and I felt something cold and wet touch the back of my neck. When I reached up to brush it away, my hand came back covered with that oily milk. It was raining down from the loft, dripping through the floorboards, coating everything in the barn with its presence. The drops that hit my skin burned like acid, but not with heat, with cold so intense it felt like fire. Where the milk touched me, I could feel my strength beginning to drain away, my will to resist growing weaker with each passing second. "Just let it happen," one of the figures in the shadows whispered, and I recognized the voice of Dr. Malcolm Peters, the veterinarian who had disappeared 6 months earlier. "It doesn't hurt after the first few minutes. The cold becomes warmth, the fear becomes peace." I tried to run again, but my legs were becoming heavy, sluggish. The milk was in my hair now, running down my face, and I could taste its sweetness on my lips. For just a moment, it didn't taste terrible. It tasted like childhood summers and mother's kisses and every good thing I'd ever lost. "That's it," Ezra encouraged, reaching out to steady me as I swayed. "Sarah's milk remembers all the love that ever was. It wants to share that with you." I was losing the fight. I could feel it. Whatever spell or curse or twisted miracle had created this place was too strong, had been fed by too much grief and desperate love to be overcome by one man's will to live. But then I saw something that gave me one last spark of hope. A window high up in the barn wall, partially hidden behind a stack of hay bales. It was small, probably meant for ventilation, but if I could reach it. I stumbled toward the wall, pretending to succumb to the milk's influence while secretly gathering my remaining strength. The cattle parted to let me pass, their dead eyes following my movements with mild interest. "Yes," Sarah's voice floated down from above, sweeter now, more childlike. "Come closer. Let me show you the pictures I've drawn in the milk. Let me tell you stories about the place where the drowned go to dream." I reached the hay bales and began to climb, my hands slipping on the oil-slick surface. Behind me, I could hear Ezra's breathing becoming excited, anticipating. "She's going to show you such wonderful things, Inspector. Things that living eyes were never meant to see." The window was just above me now, its glass dirty and cracked but still intact. I braced myself against the top hay bale and drove my elbow through the glass, feeling shards bite into my skin as I cleared away the fragments. No. Sarah's voice changed instantly from sweet to furious, becoming that terrible choir of the damned. You can't leave. You belong to us now. The barn erupted into chaos behind me as I squeezed through the window. I could hear the cattle moving with sudden violence, their hooves thundering against the wooden floor. The other prisoners, the men who had come before me, were moaning and wailing, their voices joining Sarah's in a symphony of loss and rage. I fell hard onto the muddy ground outside the barn, my shoulder striking a rock and sending lightning bolts of pain through my body. But I was outside, I was alive, and the October air had never tasted so sweet. Behind me, the barn shook as if it were being torn apart from the inside. Sarah's voice rose to an inhuman shriek, and I could see that oily milk beginning to seep through the gaps in the barn walls, creating dark stains that spread like blood. I ran toward my car, not looking back, not caring about anything except putting distance between myself and that place of impossible horrors. As I reached for the door handle, I heard Sarah's voice one last time, carried on the autumn wind like a promise and a threat. You can't run forever, Thomas Whitmore. The milk remembers your taste now. We'll find you wherever you go. My hand shook so badly I could barely start the engine, and when I finally got the Ford running, I drove away from Pine Ridge Dairy Farm as fast as the winding country roads would allow. In my rearview mirror, I could see black smoke rising from the barn, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a small figure in a white dress standing in the farmhouse window, watching me disappear into the grey October day. But even as I drove toward what I hoped was safety, I could taste something sweet and terrible on my tongue, and I knew with horrible certainty that Sarah Blackwood was right. Some things followed you no matter how far you ran. The drive back to Montpelier took 3 hours, but it felt like 3 days. Every mile I put between myself and Pine Ridge Farm should have made me feel safer, but instead, the dread in my chest grew heavier. The taste of that cursed milk lingered on my tongue no matter how much coffee I drank or how many times I rinsed my mouth. When I finally reached the state offices, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to write in my report. How could I possibly document what I'd witnessed? Who would believe that a dead girl was using supernatural milk to collect souls for her grieving father? I decided to write 2 reports, one official document citing suspected contamination and recommending the farm be quarantined pending further investigation, and another, truthful account that I would keep locked in my desk drawer, perhaps forever. But as I climbed the steps to the building, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were wet footprints on the stone steps, small ones, the size a 10-year-old girl might make. They led from the street to the front door, as if someone had walked directly here after stepping out of a creek. Inside, my secretary Mrs. Henderson looked up from her typewriter with a strange expression. Mr. Whitmore, there's a young lady here to see you. She's been waiting in your office for over an hour. My heart stopped. A young lady. Yes, she said her name was Sarah. Sweet little thing, but she's dripping wet and won't take off her coat. I offered her a towel, but she just smiled and said she was used to being cold. I walked toward my office on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Through the frosted glass door, I could see a small silhouette sitting in my chair, perfectly still. When I opened the door, Sarah Blackwood looked up at me with those terrible white eyes and smiled. She was exactly as I'd left her, white dress, long dark hair, skin pale as winter moonlight. But now she was sitting behind my desk, her small hands folded on my blotter, dripping creek water onto my important papers. "Hello, Inspector," she said in that impossible chorus voice. "I told you the milk would remember your taste." I tried to back out of the office, but the door slammed shut behind me. When I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't turn. I was trapped in my own office with a dead girl who had somehow followed me across 30 miles of Vermont countryside. How? I managed to whisper, "Milk travels, Inspector. Through pipes, through streams, through the underground rivers that connect all things." I simply followed the flow. She gestured to my water glass sitting on the desk. It was full of that oily, flour-filled milk. "Papa is very upset with you," she continued, standing up from my chair. "You broke my special jar. You made the cattle angry. Most importantly, you left before I could show you my collection." Water was pooling around her feet now, spreading across my office floor. It smelled like creek mud and lilacs and the last breath of drowning things. "I've come to give you another chance," Sarah said, walking around the desk toward me. "You can come back to the farm willingly, or I can take you back myself. But either way, you're going to help Papa understand that I'm not really gone." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another jar of that cursed milk. This one was larger than the first, and floating inside were not just tiny hands, but entire figures, men in suits and work clothes, all of them reaching upward with their mouths open in silent screams. "These are my friends," she said proudly. "They all tried to run, just like you. But now they understand that running only makes the journey longer." I pressed myself against the office door, feeling the wood grow cold at my touch. "Sarah, you need to let go. You need to rest." Her expression shifted, and for just a moment I saw the frightened child underneath all that supernatural horror. "But if I let go, Papa will be all alone. He loves me so much, Inspector. His love is the only thing keeping me warm in the cold, dark place where drowned girls go." "Your father's love doesn't have to be a chain," I said desperately. "Love can also mean letting someone find peace." She considered this for a moment, tilting her head like a curious bird. "But I don't want peace. I want to be with Papa forever. I want to help him make the milk sweet and keep the farm running and sing lullabies when he can't sleep." The water around her feet was rising now, and I could feel it seeping through my shoes. It was so cold it burned, and I realized she was bringing the creek with her, the place where she had died. "One last chance, Inspector," she said, holding out the jar. "Drink willingly, and you'll keep your mind when you join my collection. Fight, and you'll spend eternity screaming in the milk while your body walks around the farm doing Papa's chores." I looked at that jar of nightmares and made the hardest decision of my life. I grabbed my letter opener from the desk and drove it towards Sarah's chest, knowing it probably wouldn't hurt her but hoping it might disrupt whatever force was keeping her here. The blade passed through her as if she were made of mist, but the metal touched something solid, a small locket hanging around her neck that I hadn't noticed before. The moment the letter opener touched the locket, Sarah let out a shriek that shattered every piece of glass in my office. The jar fell from her hands and exploded against the floor, releasing its prisoners in a flood of milk and screaming voices. "My locket," she cried, grabbing for the small silver heart that now hung cracked and tarnishing around her throat. "Papa gave it to me for my birthday. You've broken Papa's gift." But as the locket crumbled, something extraordinary happened. The water around Sarah's feet began to recede, and her white eyes flickered, showing hints of natural brown underneath. For just a moment, she looked like what she truly was, a frightened little girl who had been lost for far too long. I can't hear Papa anymore," she whispered, her voice becoming truly her own for the first time since I'd met her. "I can't feel his love holding me here." The supernatural cold in the room began to fade, and Sarah's image started to waver like heat shimmers on summer pavement. She looked down at her hands as they became transparent, then back up at me with an expression of wonder and terror. "I'm leaving," she said, and now she sounded like the child she should have been. "I'm going somewhere else. Somewhere warmer." "Sarah," I said gently, "it's going to be all right." She smiled then, and it was the first genuine, innocent smile I'd seen from her. "Will you tell Papa that I love him? Will you tell him that it's okay to let me go?" Before I could answer, she was gone, leaving only the faintest scent of lilacs and the sound of water receding into some distant, peaceful place. I sat in my ruined office for a long time after that, staring at the broken glass and the dark stains on my floor. Eventually, Mrs. Henderson knocked on the door, asking if everything was all right. When I let her in, she took one look at the destruction and assumed I'd had some kind of breakdown. Maybe I had. I submitted my quarantine report that afternoon and never spoke of what really happened at Pine Ridge Dairy Farm. 6 months later, I learned that Ezra Blackwood had been found dead in his barn, apparently from a heart attack. The cattle were all found dead as well, their bodies already weeks into decomposition. The farm was sold at auction and eventually burned down under mysterious circumstances. Today, nothing remains of Pine Ridge Dairy Farm except a foundation covered by wild lilacs that bloom every spring, regardless of the weather. But sometimes, on quiet October evenings when the mist rolls through the Vermont hills, I still taste something sweet and terrible on my tongue. And I know that somewhere in the space between life and death, a little girl named Sarah Blackwood has finally found her way home to whatever peace awaits the drowned and the lost. That was 47 years ago, and I'm an old man now, sitting in this nursing home in Brattleboro, telling my story to anyone who will listen. Most people think I'm senile, that my mind has finally cracked under the weight of too many years and too many memories. But I know what I saw, what I tasted, what I barely escaped from in that cursed barn. The milk still comes to me sometimes in my dreams, sweet and terrible and full of floating flowers that pulse like dying hearts. In those dreams, I'm back in that hayloft with Sarah, watching her pour secrets from a jar that should never have existed. And sometimes, when I wake up, my pillow is damp with something that tastes like creek water and lost love. I've spent decades trying to understand what happened at Pine Ridge Dairy Farm. Was it grief so powerful it could anchor a soul to the living world? Was it love twisted into something monstrous by a father's inability to let go? Or was it simply the natural order of things, showing me that death is not always the end, that sometimes it's just another kind of beginning? I think about Ezra Blackwood often, that broken man who loved his daughter so much he couldn't let her rest. I understand now that he wasn't evil, just a father whose heart had shattered so completely that the pieces cut reality itself, creating wounds through which impossible things could bleed into our world. And I think about Sarah, that sweet, terrible child who found a way to crawl back from the grave through the power of her father's devotion. In the end, she wasn't a monster either, just a little girl who was lost and cold and desperate to go home. The locket was the key, I realize now. Some physical anchor that tied her spirit to her father's love, that kept her trapped between worlds. When it broke, she was finally free to follow whatever light waited for the drowned and the lost. I hope she found peace. I hope she found warmth. I hope that somewhere in whatever place exists beyond the veil of death, a little girl named Sarah Blackwood is finally, truly home. But on nights like this, when the October wind howls around the nursing home and I can smell lilacs through my window despite the late season, I remember the taste of that impossible milk and wonder if some stories ever really end, or if they just flow onward like underground rivers, carrying their secrets toward shores we were never meant to see. If you've made it this far into my tale, you might want to check out some of the other stories I've collected over the years. Tales of things that lurk in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, waiting for the unwary to stumble into their web of shadows and sorrow.